Hello, I'm Georgia, and I'm an autistic rentagob person who posts sometimes. I also work in autism policy and have spent quite a lot of time recently grappling with the crisis in autism assessments, though views here are my own. According to NHS statistics, over 200,000 people are currently waiting for an autism assessment in England. It's now considered normal to wait for several years. Even after diagnosis, there's a huge gaping void where support for autistic people should be, resulting in scandal after scandal after scandal. And successive governments have failed to really address this in any meaningful way. Over the past year or so, in particular, I've noticed a real increase in, for want of a better word, hostility towards autistic people in the press and in politics. A constant stream of headlines like these, implying that those stuck waiting aren't really autistic, those of us with a diagnosis shouldn't have one, we're getting along just fine, don't worry about it. Often these pieces treat neurodivergent conditions like ADHD and autism, and mental health conditions like depression and anxiety as one big blob. Ministers in the previous and the current government have echoed these narratives, also both in the context of sweeping cuts to disability benefits, which is a convenient time to say some disabled people don't exist. But recently, a lot of the think pieces have had the same author, neurologist Dr. Suzanne O'Sullivan, promoting her new book, The Age of Diagnosis: Sickness, Health and Why Medicine Has Gone Too Far. As the book sets out, Dr. O'Sullivan doesn't just believe autism is overdiagnosed, but also ADHD, depression, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, Lyme disease, long COVID, cancer. You get the idea. I should note at this point that The Age of Diagnosis is not the only book about overdiagnosis of autism to have been published over the past month. By my count, there's two more, both of which have also featured heavily in the press. There's a whole ants versus a bug's life situation for books pushing a flawed narrative on autism right now. But this one is the broadest in scope and has had the lion's share of the press coverage. The constant stream of new articles in my Google alerts quickly got my attention, and eventually I thought, instead of getting mad about all of these columns individually, wouldn't it be more efficient to just read the book? And sure enough, my local library came through. So, why did I do this to myself? Well, Dr. O'Sullivan and the other writers in this space aren't the government. They don't have the obvious incentive to convince us there are fewer disabled people than there really are so they can balance their sums. O'Sullivan wrote this book because she actually sincerely believes in it. So I came to this in good faith, at least as best I could, wondering if, away from the sensationalist, clickbait world of headlines, The Age of Diagnosis would present a more robust version of the overdiagnosis argument than is generally presented in the press. It doesn't. I would say there are elements that are so close to a point that's worth exploring a bit more, like around the social environment and lack of support, but instead the blame is shifted to diagnosis. Then there are other elements that are completely off the mark, and there are elements that just dive headfirst into culture wars. As I mentioned, the age of diagnosis is very broad. Dr. O'Sullivan is a neurologist specialising in epilepsy and psychosomatic disorders. In the introduction, O'Sullivan outlines why she wrote this book. In recent times, I have grown particularly worried for the large number of young people referred to me with 3, 4 or 5 pre-existing diagnoses of chronic conditions, only some of which can be cured. Worth noting, O'Sullivan does not specialise in the conditions themselves. This sentence is followed by a long list of conditions, including fibromyalgia and polycystic ovarian syndrome, neither of which are ever mentioned again. Similarly, the first sentence of the blurb mentions allergies, which don't come up at all in the book itself. The main body of the book has 6 chapters covering different conditions: Huntington disease, Lyme disease and long COVID, autism, the cancer gene, ADHD, depression and neurodiversity, and syndrome without a name. Obviously, some of these cover very different areas to others, like the ethics around genetic screening for Huntington's and certain cancers. As you can see, the way neurodivergent conditions have been slotted in is already quite confusing, and many of the chapters also keep going back into conditions that have previously been discussed. This isn't supposed to be a page-by-page read. I am going to be focusing here on autism and some of the wider related points around neurodivergence and mental health, because that's what I actually know, and I don't want to wade into conditions I know nothing about and get things wrong. I'm not going to get into every case study or every statistic. I mostly want to look at some of the key arguments and the bits that maybe do a double take. In the introduction, Dr. O'Sullivan defines overdiagnosis in a way that surprised me. A diagnosis that is correct, but which does not benefit the patient and may arguably do harm. As a layperson, that was not what I took it to mean, and I don't think it's what most readers will take it to mean. At various points throughout the book, O'Sullivan does slip into using the term in the more commonly understood way to mean, I don't believe you have this condition at all. But in the introduction, she refers to this as over-medicalisation, which she defines as when ordinary human differences, behaviour and life stages are given medical labels. It's worth saying, O'Sullivan is not one of these people that outright thinks that autism and ADHD don't exist. Throughout the book, she refers to her own autistic patients, a young family friend with severe ADHD, and in the Huntington's chapter, refers to a case study being denied treatment for ADHD because she has the Huntington's gene. She also explicitly makes clear in the introduction that this is not about rationing care or saving money for health services. So that's something. So, the autism chapter. We're first introduced to Poppy, a young woman who experienced bullying, eating disorders, suicidality, work difficulties, and an abusive relationship before eventually receiving an autism diagnosis. Poppy, to use Dr. O'Sullivan's words, hasn't had any specific medical intervention for autism, but she's happier, she unmasks her autistic traits when she can, and she feels better able to manage her difficulties. Asked what support she'd been offered by the NHS, Poppy says she didn't even get a leaflet. But I'm glad, because of the harmful information that people in the NHS and special education system still hold about autism, citing things like functioning labels and person-first language. Rather than questioning why Poppy was discharged after diagnosis with no support at all, which unfortunately is par for the course for autistic people, O'Sullivan then focuses on language controversies around autism, and then goes on to completely ignore them for the rest of the book, so that's a choice. A lot of the terms used to describe autism and neurodivergence throughout the age of diagnosis are not terms that I would generally use or that the autistic community would generally prefer, but obviously I am going to be quoting the book directly and engaging with it on its own terms, so please bear that in mind. Dr. O'Sullivan asks if Poppy's struggle to manage might be a consequence of her negative experiences rather than a neurodevelopmental brain disorder. So if you don't suffer enough, you're not really autistic, but if you do, your difficulties are down to that suffering instead. Got it. Poppy, for what it's worth, does attribute her difficulties to her traumatic experiences, but also attributes those experiences to other people picking up on her differences. We then continue into the prevalence rates. O'Sullivan says most people in the developed world will have noticed the rising number of people with a diagnosis of autism. She then reports an autism researcher's sceptical reaction to data in Northern Ireland apparently showing 5% of school-aged children have an autism diagnosis, but then repeating that statistic as 1 in 5, or 20%. I suppose it's easily done. I've been there, but it's not the only time this happens in the book, and it does make me wonder how many other figures in other chapters I just accepted reading through this because it's not the area that I know enough about to go, oh, that looks wrong, and then check out the endnotes. There are references throughout the book to a big block of endnotes at the back, but it's not done in the most consistent way. There were certainly enough citations needed that I've had the mystery biscuits jingle in my head all week. One example, this chapter gives a 1 in 36 prevalence rate for autistic children in the UK. That is within range of various studies and does correspond roughly to Department for Education's data about children with special educational needs in England, but there's no source cited for this. The following sentence cites a Daily Telegraph interview with Professor Sir Simon Baron-Cohen where he uses that stat. In context, he is not referring to any particular country, and as far as I can tell, he probably got it from the US-based Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which assesses prevalence in the US. Oddly, O'Sullivan does also cite that figure correctly for the US much earlier in the chapter, so I'm not sure what happened there. Incidentally, when Baron Cohen was asked about overdiagnosis in that Telegraph interview, he responded, "I am less worried about that. I think the rates we see today are getting closer to the true rate." Dr. O'Sullivan points out that there are no physical tests or objective clinical signs for autism. We will see more of this argument in the section on ADHD later, so I won't spend too much time on it now. What I will say is it does set the scene for what is a very outsider perspective on autism, looking at autism as how the autistic person's behaviour affects you and not what they're experiencing themselves. Later on in the section on depression, we begin to see references to the phrase mental health and behavioural disorders, which is not that unusual, but again, it's a focus on behaviour that affects others. On that note, sensory differences, which are a pretty big part of the everyday experience for most autistic people, are only mentioned in this book once, as Dr. O'Sullivan runs through the history of autism in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the big book of diagnoses used primarily in the US, but also around the world. From now on, I'll call it the DSM. Sensory differences were included as a diagnostic feature of autism in the DSM-5 in 2013. That's still the most recent version. In the history, O'Sullivan summarises Leo Kanner's original research on autism, characterised by a complete inability to relate in any ordinary way to others, through to Lorna Wing in the 1960s, changing the degree to which the typical symptoms had to be present. She says the DSM-5, published in 2013, moved the goalposts again, reducing the number of essential symptoms, crucially allowing the possibility that they may be masked by learned strategies, and that this invited older people and those with milder atypical presentations into the group. I'm not sure why there's so much surprise about there being older autistic people. Autistic children grow up. As part of the DSM-5 definition, as O'Sullivan points out, there must also be evidence of impairment. She says this is easy to spot at the severe end of the spectrum, but much less well defined at the mild end of the spectrum. As this is going to come up so many times throughout the age of diagnosis, I thought it was worth exploring a little bit more about why I take quite a dim view of the use of mild and severe in this way as two opposing factions. The language around autism has changed a lot over the years. A lot of this is due to how heterogeneous autism is. About 30% of autistic people will be speaking few or no words by age 19. Similarly, about a third of autistic people have a learning disability, though it's worth noting that those proportions do vary by different age groups, basically because we're recognising more autistic people, particularly those who don't have a learning disability. But it is a pretty big proportion compared to the general population. And given how autism was initially researched from this kind of outsider perspective, obviously those whose disabilities were more apparent were noticed first. I was diagnosed about 20 years ago, and my diagnosis is Asperger's syndrome. The term high-functioning autism also was bandied around. Those aren't words that tend to come up these days or that I would generally use. As the age of diagnosis goes into, in 2013, the latest revision of the DSM basically amalgamated all of those different diagnoses on the autistic spectrum into one autistic spectrum disorder. There are in the DSM still levels indicators for low, medium or high support needs. The World Health Organization's ICD-11 does not include that. It simply includes indicators for if there is a language disability or a learning disability or both. But these initial additional diagnoses on the autism spectrum were essentially part of recognising that the autistic spectrum is broader than we thought. Hans Asperger's work was popularised by Lorna Wing, who is mentioned in The Age of Diagnosis as basically coming up with this idea of the autistic spectrum. Every autistic person is different, and of course, some will face more challenges than others. It would be disingenuous to suggest otherwise. People like me are overrepresented in the autism discourse. However, in this context, as we'll see as we go through the rest of the book, the word mild is kind of just thinly veiled disbelief. You don't look like what an autistic person looks like in my head, so I don't believe you. I am not being, forced by the nature of your needs to confront the fact that you have needs, so I'm going to decide that you don't. You're so high functioning, they said, as I had another meltdown in the school corridor. And we also have to think about the flip side of that. High functioning implies a low functioning, which sounds kind of insulting, and in general, these kinds of extremes tend to write off an entire group of people. You have people whose needs are ignored, and you have people whose strengths are ignored. It can be helpful to talk about the challenges and needs that different groups of autistic people have, but on an individual level, terms like mild and severe are far too broad to really mean anything. If somebody was non-speaking and had seizures, those would be important things to know if you were caring for that person. But severe autism doesn't necessarily mean that. You can have someone who attracts that label who can speak at least to a certain extent and who doesn't have co-occurring epilepsy. Often these are kind of used as all or nothing stereotypes based on a person's impression of a particular autistic person in a particular context. I'm not having a meltdown right now. That doesn't mean I never have them. It just means that generally they're not being filmed. To a certain extent, the status of a person as mildly autistic is also quite precarious. I definitely had this myself with the pandemic. You can be someone who lives independently, who is employed, who for all intents and purposes doesn't look disabled. One thing goes wrong and you're suddenly in a very different situation. We know how high the numbers are for autistic people being sectioned under the Mental Health Act, and many of them are not known to services until that happens. Would we say their autism is mild still? As we record this in May 2025, INSAR, the International Autism Research Conference, is debating the topic. So this is an area that's going to still continue to develop. But generally, when mild and severe get pitted against each other like this, it's an attempt to divide and conquer without really engaging with what any autistic people actually need and how to meet those needs. And I think that's going to become apparent as we go through the book. The book goes on to give a lot of different prevalence rates from different parts of the world, all, again, at the higher end of our estimates on this, but certainly not unreasonable. She does cite the Northern Ireland data correctly at this point, and then a 2020 study that compares different states in the US, and then this. Leaving aside what this company primarily does, this is pretty clearly a search engine optimization article, and having checked, it's the third result for a Google search of what country has the highest rate of autism. Make of that what you will. These astonishing increases in the prevalence of the disorder, O'Sullivan says, are what has led to the concern for some that autism is now significantly overdiagnosed. There's a lot of this, some say, many fear. Who? And who's driving this increase? That's right, it's those pesky women. Autism in women was considered previously to be very uncommon, but the male to female ratio is now thought to be closer to 2-1, as O'Sullivan points out. She notes that despite the substantial rise in diagnoses, many autism specialists, there it is again, are certain that there is still an underdiagnosis problem, especially in girls and women. O'Sullivan then presents several arguments supporting this, including the idea that some in society don't think females can be autistic, so miss the diagnosis by not looking hard enough when presented with a girl or women who may meet the diagnostic criteria. Or that females exhibit autistic traits in a slightly different way, which current tests don't pick up, or they are particularly adept at masking. Dr. O'Sullivan then takes some of these points in turn, arguing that some of these underdiagnosis arguments have conceptual flaws, such as the theory that females are underdiagnosed because their autistic traits are too subtle to be noticed. She argues that autistic traits exist on a continuum, meaning we all have some, but in small amounts they do not cause impairments, and that if scrutiny is required to pick up subtle symptoms, does that risk placing too much emphasis on social difficulties that are actually below the threshold? Again, it's worth asking here, subtle for the person or subtle for everyone else around them? O'Sullivan dismisses the idea of a different female phenotype for autism, as essentially constituting a different thing to the original phenotype, arguing that changes to the fundamental description of what autism looks like the increased social pressure on girls making autistic girls more socially motivated than autistic boys, have to be questioned. She dismisses the idea that it has been traditionally thought of as a male disorder because Leo Kanner's original study featured 3 girls. She's quite dismissive of the idea of masking, arguing that nobody is born knowing social rules. Children have to be taught how to behave within socially acceptable limits. So how can we distinguish between this and masking? If we're arguing here that everyone is masking, maybe we should change stuff? Quote, "The difference once lay in the amount of effort required to be normal, but now the assessors no longer need the mask to drop. A person may appear entirely socially capable, and it is enough for them to describe a great deal of effort. This is called listening. You may have heard of it." What's frustrating is that in the previous chapter, which covered Lyme disease, Dr. O'Sullivan argued that tests for the bacterium that causes Lyme are not strictly diagnostic tests because you can be exposed to that bacterium without getting symptoms. She argues that diagnosis is a clinical art and that you need a clinician to explore the full context and make a decision based on this, not just the hard scores on tests. But here, the argument seems to be that the patient story isn't relevant and it's all about ticking the test boxes. Also, have you noticed we're missing something? Let's go back to that first paragraph on arguments that women are underdiagnosed with autism, which included, "Some in society don't think females can be autistic, so miss the diagnosis by not looking hard enough when presented with a girl or woman who may meet the diagnostic criteria." The book never returns to this argument. A UK longitudinal study found that girls are less likely to receive a diagnosis than boys, even with the same levels of autistic traits. More recently, an implicit association test study found that in their sample of 300 participants, several autistic traits were explicitly perceived as male, with participants also much more quickly associating autism-related words with male names compared to female names. Leo Kanner may have included autistic girls, but so much of the decades of research, awareness campaigns, and media representation that followed him did not, and that all has an impact today. O'Sullivan describes diagnosis creep and says there has to be a point at which a person who doesn't have the right symptoms simply doesn't have the diagnosis. This is where we bring in the next argument, that this point is when new people are being diagnosed, but there is no evidence that it is benefiting them, or when the diagnosis is causing more harm than good. And here, we reach a key problem, the autism support gap. As I said earlier, many autistic people after diagnosis are sent away with nothing more than a leaflet or a website. And as the years and decades roll on, there's no way back into the system as your needs change. Instead, you have to work with mainstream services who don't necessarily understand autism. There's too little research focusing on the support autistic people want, and the government's action plan for this due in 2022 never happened. The result? Constant, terrible outcomes, sometimes costing lives. Diagnosis should be the beginning of the journey, so yeah, autistic people aren't benefiting from that alone. The problem isn't overdiagnosis, the problem is the support gap. Dr. O'Sullivan notes that some treatments can cause harms, and in her view, the mildly effective have the least to gain and are more vulnerable to harm. She cites a systematic review which found that most studies on early intervention for autism did not measure potential harms adequately. That's really important because too many autistic people have been subjected to dangerous fake cures or therapies, which may have done more harm than good in an effort to make them appear less autistic, which isn't something autistic people tend to want in and of itself. But the potential harms outlined in the age of diagnosis are different. To quote O'Sullivan, the stigma of autism has been associated with low self-esteem in children. Self-determination could be eroded by an autism diagnosis. She then goes on to cite a Turkish study showing autistic children have reduced participation in sports. This could be down to ableism and exclusion, and down to just being autistic and finding these things difficult. It's not necessarily down to the diagnosis. Similarly, O'Sullivan notes the impact of the assessment process, medicalisation, and parental stress, which can all be huge, but if parents are seeking an autism assessment for their child, they're generally pretty stressed already. I'm not sure we can blame the diagnosis for that. O'Sullivan argues the diagnosis might become a self-fulfilling prophecy, as some will take the diagnosis to mean they can't do certain things, so won't even try. She does cite a paper here that's looking at self-fulfilling prophecies in the classroom. It does not seem to be related to clinical diagnosis at all, or autism specifically. I would say in my experience, knowing what your needs are is not all like, oh, I'll never be able to do this thing because I'm autistic and I can't change that. Sometimes it's, well, I find this particular bit difficult because lots of autistic people find this particular bit difficult, so I can work around it this way and maybe do more of the thing. O'Sullivan notes that diagnosis can obscure psychosocial difficulties that really need to be addressed, or makes it too easy to stop people asking what in this child's life is making them sick. Diagnostic overshadowing is a real thing. Lots of health problems in autistic people are missed because clinicians sometimes just blame the autism. But that doesn't have to be the case. We can tackle those biases. We can tackle diagnostic overshadowing without tackling diagnosis. O'Sullivan claims that there is evidence of early diagnosis and support helping children develop socially. Does not go into what that is, but that in adults, there is no good evidence for either lack of harm or benefit with the diagnosis. Of course, some of us got diagnosed as children and then grew up, but that's never really covered as an experience. O'Sullivan notes that in the general population, and in young people in particular, there is a rise in mental ill health, school dropouts, and unemployment, and argues that if the increased number of children with an autism diagnosis was just a correcting of an underdiagnosis problem, one would hope to see an improvement in mental health or social functioning by now, but the opposite is true. Again, as O'Sullivan points out, a diagnosis isn't going to help you very much on its own. The support needs to be there, and right now it isn't. Also, our understanding of mental health has improved. Also, the world's on fire. She notes that a diagnosis may provide a feeling of relief, but that cannot justify overdiagnosis if the long-term outcomes have not been sufficiently examined, and that the struggles are real, but medicalising them may not be the solution. Then what is? At this point, we meet Miles. Not this one. Fun fact. Of the 17 anonymised case studies included in the age of diagnosis, Miles is the only man who is interviewed directly. There are 3 further case studies where O'Sullivan speaks to a mother about her son. One of those concerns a non-speaking autistic man, so we'll get to them later. And a 4th where she speaks to a wife about her husband. The remaining 12 case studies are all about women. I don't know what to make of this. I wonder if it's about stigma and about men not coming forward. But it is also interesting to me that this has happened in a book where many of the case studies are framed as being overdiagnosed. Anyway, Miles was diagnosed in his 50s after a second private autism assessment, following lifelong difficulties with work and relationships. When asked how he would like to refer to his diagnosis, Miles says, "Don't call it a disorder." Dr. O'Sullivan makes a point of disagreeing with this because autism spectrum disorder is the DSM terminology. It's worth noting later on in the ADHD chapter, O'Sullivan notes that the DSM is born out of consensus by committee rather than through scientific advancement, but it is suddenly made to seem scientifically concrete. In general, she is not a fan of our tendency to use the DSM as kind of this Bible that can never be wrong. So why is she so keen on doing that here? other than to take a side and make people angry. Miles explicitly rejects the idea put forward by O'Sullivan that some autistic people are more disabled than others. Now, I don't agree with Miles here, but that has nothing to do with the central premise of overdiagnosis. Miles clearly has quite strong views on not pathologising autism at all, which you would think, given the previous argument, would appeal to Dr. O'Sullivan, as it would take most autistic people out of the diagnostic framework altogether. But he is referred to and criticised throughout the rest of the chapter. In general, I would say the burdens of proof in this are pretty wild. The case studies, and by extension, the autistic community, seem to have perfect views, which these case studies don't, and a perfect conceptual understanding of their neurodivergence, which science doesn't have, to disprove O'Sullivan's own theories. To quote, Miles is one of a very large and growing number of autistic people who disagree with the medical profession's deficit-based approach to diagnosis, preferring an approach that concentrates more on what makes an autistic person special. Different. The word you're looking for is different. Then O'Sullivan goes on to talk about some of the diagnostic tests used in autism, in particular the ADOS, Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, which is a series of activities that the person does, and then the ADIR, Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised, a set of questions. As before, she argues that those tests come with many caveats and are not supposed to be able to deliver a diagnosis by themselves. We're back to clinical context is important. And yet, O'Sullivan then argues that impairment is difficult to quantify because there's no DSM definition at the mild end, and that it is entirely at the discretion of the assessor to decide whether something really counts as impairment. Do you want a clinician's nuanced decision or not? O'Sullivan notes, correctly, that these tests have primarily been validated on people who are white and speak English as their first language, so it's not clear whether they're equally effective and applicable to different cultures, but also different age groups, people who have other disabilities, and so on. That's an important research question. But what are we meant to do in the meantime? Not diagnose those people? In the conclusion, O'Sullivan notes, as I write, new criteria are being drawn up to make autism a more available diagnosis for women. Again, it's not quite clear which project is being referred to here. This work is being done before we have established whether diagnosing women with autism makes their lives better or worse. So does she want research on the effectiveness of current tools for different groups of people or not? It's not clear. The book then goes on to discuss pressure on healthcare systems to make more diagnoses more quickly, which O'Sullivan argues is likely contributing to the overdiagnosis and misdiagnosis of autism. Another interesting statistical error here. The autism waiting list is obviously very high. The book claims that it's almost 6 times higher than it really is. Essentially what's happened here, hello Prince, is that Dr. O'Sullivan has cited a Nuffield Trust analysis. Can you meow at like important times when I've finished making a point and it's like you're agreeing? Can you do that? Essentially what's happened here is O'Sullivan has cited a Nuffield Trust analysis of waiting times from last year. The first sentence of that report starts with as many as 1.2 million autistic people in England. To be clear, that's the number of autistic people estimated to be in England, diagnosed, undiagnosed, everybody. The Age of Diagnosis reports that figure as people waiting to be assessed for autism in England, which, to be clear, the Nuffield Trust piece just uses NHS England data from the time, which was about 172,000 people. O'Sullivan notes, without again citing where this has come from, that in the US, educational professionals are being trained to use the ADOS. But, she says, the ADOS was only ever intended to supplement a clinical diagnosis. That, to be fair, sounds like we need better tools, but again, do you want these children on the clinical pathway or supported outside of the clinical pathway? You can't have neither. She also notes widespread disparities in autism diagnosis rates by different clinicians and services, which is definitely very true. This comes up in ADHD as well. We do need better standardisation, but that's not just overdiagnosis, that's also underdiagnosis. And when we really don't know what prevalence rates really are, it's hard to tell. Later, there's a quote from an autism researcher, Uta Frith, who argues that the diagnosis of autism has been stretched to breaking point and has outgrown its purpose. If the purpose is to predict what an individual's needs are, this is no longer possible. Researchers need to think hard about how to disentangle the underlying conditions in individuals now labelled autistic. This is kind of true. We could have a debate about, whether and how we divide autism into different subgroups and categorizations, but that whole concept has been undermined by the fact that there is just widespread distrust of this in the autistic community now, precisely because of this kind of rhetoric where everyone who is labelled mild just doesn't get believed. So, not helping your case. O'Sullivan makes similar arguments later in the chapter on ADHD and depression that the science of depression, like that of autism and ADHD, has been severely muddied by the gradual homogenization of the disorders, with severe and mild depression being treated as if they're the same. Again, not necessarily. Lots of studies on depression and indeed on autism do differentiate either through scores on specific measures or things like IQ or communication ability. Obviously, none of those are perfect. It's almost like it's impossible to divide these groups neatly or something. This is an argument for different labels. It's not an argument for no diagnosis at all. We begin, as we get to the end of the autism chapter, to move away from diagnosis in general. We then move on to what O'Sullivan describes as a social contagion element, arguing that social media is filled with people celebrating an autism diagnosis, many of whom misrepresent the disorder. She cites a study of the top 133 TikTok videos under the autism hashtag, which classified only 27% as accurate. What the book doesn't tell you is that only 41% were classified as inaccurate and 32% were just overgeneralized. And not all of those were autistic people, let alone people celebrating their own diagnosis. There are issues here, but it's an algorithm problem, not a diagnosis problem. The book notes that mainstream media creates a somewhat romanticized view of the disorder, presenting it as something that makes a person special rather than a developmental disorder that causes impairment. Citing the diagnoses of two famous women, of course. O'Sullivan notes celebrities make bold statements about neurodevelopmental disorders without seeming to understand them. Who would do such a thing? And yes, the casual use of on the spectrum, which is what's being discussed here, is an issue, but that's not the same as overdiagnosis. The next section is about what O'Sullivan describes as considerable social pressure from some people with mild autism to dispense with terms like severe autism and pressure on scientists to consider all people with autism as a single group. O'Sullivan then cites Spectrum 10K, a large-scale research study in the UK which was paused and ultimately abandoned due to public outcry, basically. O'Sullivan notes that population-based genetic studies like this are very common, and that those objections did not come from individuals with severe autism or their families. Didn't they? Got a citation for that? O'Sullivan says, that cuts to the heart of my personal concern about the overdiagnosis trend in autism. Those severely disabled people who could not live in the world without support, they are now in a queue for resources alongside people with considerably fewer difficulties. The one concrete example of taking up resources comes from our next case study. Agatha, the mother of Elijah, a non-speaking autistic man with learning disabilities. She says a school for autism opened up nearby, but they'll only take children with a normal IQ who can meet the national curriculum. Agatha has some interesting views about autistic campaigners in general. She says the whole autism discourse is being dominated by the mild voice, and she explicitly blames the school situation on this. By the way, Elijah is 20 and has been employed by a local business with support and supervision, so this is all academic. She says, these mild and self-identified people have no concept of people like Elijah. O'Sullivan notes, one question was constantly on my mind as I spoke to Miles and even Poppy. They speak for people with severe classical autism, a term not used until this point, but have they ever met one? O'Sullivan contrasts Miles being completely against any medical intervention and Agatha needing to teach Elijah to tolerate sounds he could cope with so he wouldn't end up in residential care. There's no indication of how Elijah was taught this, but it's sort of assumed by Agatha that people with mild autism would be against it. She describes the time Elijah had a public meltdown on a bus, and I realised all the other passengers were staring at me, so I turned around and said, "This is what autism looks like, not what you saw on the telly last night." Then the chapter ends. Unlike Miles, Poppy, or most other case studies in the Age of Diagnosis, Agatha's views are completely uncommented on, unchallenged, and uncriticised. Now, I could engage here. I could concede that people with learning disabilities are underrepresented in autistic advocacy. I could point out that Poppy and Miles only spoke about that group at all when O'Sullivan asked directly, and if she wanted to know if they'd met one, she could have asked. I could talk about the history of autism research, which would make clear where that distrust in genetic research has come from. I could ask, what are these resources we're meant to be taking away from people with severe autism? Because it sounds like nobody's getting the support they need. I could ask, if that school for autistic people who can learn the national curriculum wasn't there, would there be a school for people like Elijah, or would there be nothing? I could ask, why aren't we fighting for both? What if we improved support, understanding, and media representation, which everyone wants, rather than only ever thinking about autistic people with the highest support needs as some kind of gotcha? I could cite a 2016 Swedish study on causes of early death in autistic people, which found that those they termed high functioning were 9 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population, and the 2014 UK cohort study of people diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which found that 2/3 of their sample had considered suicide and 1/3 had actually made plans. But the thing is, what on earth does any of that have to do with diagnosis? You can see why I ended up making a video about this. So, in the later chapter on ADHD, depression, and neurodiversity, yeah, we'll get into that, we open with Anna, who was diagnosed with ADHD in her 40s. She says she feels better on medication, but when asked if her life is better, she says yes and no. Work have tried to be supportive, but neither Anna nor her employer knows what she really needs. Again, support gap. Similar to autism, there's a real question around what support needs to look like, and that's not the fault of diagnosis itself. Throughout this chapter, Dr. O'Sullivan uses the language of mild versus severe for ADHD and depression. These were not terms I was familiar with in ADHD. The DSM-5 does use them, but the ICD, International Classification of Diseases system preferred in the UK, and I think Ireland, where Dr. O'Sullivan is from, does not differentiate in that way in ADHD. O'Sullivan notes that being diagnosed with ADHD for the first time in adulthood has only become possible in the last several years. She describes her friend's daughter with severe ADHD and says that diagnostic rates of severe ADHD are actually quite stable. Those with severe ADHD are now vastly outnumbered by those with mild ADHD, with staggering increases, almost all at the milder end of the spectrum. To explain this, she says that more than 85% of children with ADHD worldwide are in the mild to moderate group. I initially struggled to verify this, there's no citation in the book, but I did eventually land on a US population-based study with figures that match the claim. That study found that most children with ADHD, 43.7%, were considered to have moderate ADHD, 41.8% mild ADHD, and then the remaining 14.5% severe ADHD. Interesting choice to group two of those together to try and pit mild against severe. No wonder I struggled to find anything. The book goes on to note that new diagnosis in adulthood has gone from being very rare, didn't you just say it was impossible, to as high as 1 in 20 adults in some places. These almost all fall in the mild domain. To back this up, O'Sullivan cites a Washington Post article, which in turn cites a study, and then a resource by the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence in the UK. None of those sources use the word mild or refer to severity levels. O'Sullivan claims that many of the same uncertainties and controversies that apply to autism also apply to ADHD. For example, the use of rating scales to help with ADHD diagnosis relies on self-reported symptoms. Isn't that how anything works? Clinical context, patient story, it's important. Presumably, O'Sullivan says, any person who seeks out an assessment for ADHD will only do so because they are struggling in some aspect of their life, which means they all will be considered impaired. So close to an epiphany. So close. The book then notes high co-occurrence between ADHD, autism, and mental health conditions. The DSM did not allow for dual autism and ADHD diagnosis until the 2013 revision, and autism and ADHD traits do have some overlap. O'Sullivan argues, many believe that this is to be expected because neurodevelopmentally divergent brains are at risk of multiple different mood and behavioural problems. But perhaps more likely is that these disorders are so poorly defined that the same people are getting multiple diagnoses to explain the same difficulties. In my view, these are two sides of the same coin. If you are neurodivergent, you are likely to be neurodivergent in more than one way. Brains don't always fit the imperfect diagnostic boxes that we give them, so you could have traits from one condition and traits from another, and you might meet diagnostic criteria for one or both. And lots of people would rather not have multiple labels. That's why the term ADHD has sprung into being. We then get into the idea that ADHD does not have a proven biological cause. Studies, says O'Sullivan, have shown structural brain differences in children with ADHD compared to controls, but these are group comparisons, not individuals. No studies cited. Radiologists cannot diagnose ADHD on a scan, she says, because people with ADHD have normal brain scans. She makes the same argument for brain activation studies, says there's mixed evidence on heritability and genetic influences, mixed to low quality evidence on the low dopamine levels theory, which, to quote her, seeds itself into conversation even before absolute proof is established. It's good to highlight the limitations of studies, but the bar is being set very high, rightly so, in what is still a fairly new area of research. But when it is theories that the book does support, the burden of proof seems to be you disprove it. The only study cited in this section is a meta-analysis of genome-wide association studies which showed 22% heritability of ADHD, which is lower than twin studies have suggested, as O'Sullivan points out, but it is still pretty high. None of this, Dr. O'Sullivan argues, is to say that ADHD is not biological and that further biomedical research is not needed. But biological does not automatically equal disease or disorder. Time to move the goalposts again! Dr. O'Sullivan argues, as much milder versions of ADHD are identified, the group of people with the label becomes so heterogeneous that biological commonalities are hard to find. It may be that children with severe ADHD do have a discrete condition for which there is a single strong genetic association, but that will become harder to prove as the ADHD community draws in new populations. So that's why when autism and ADHD were much more rarely diagnosed, we found all those autism and ADHD genes, right? We didn't. Oh, okay. In the next paragraph, despite decades of work, no biomedical research project has succeeded in finding any brain abnormality common to ADHD sufferers. Again, her words. There are no biomarkers that allow behaviours exhibited by people with ADHD to be distinguished from other disorders or even from normal human experience. So does a clear biological cause matter or not? Yet, we continue to gather people who have the traits considered consistent with ADHD under one medical category, studying and treating them as if they were a single group, all of whom unequivocally have a brain development disorder. What is the alternative for research finding out more? Even if you draw the line on who counts as having ADHD much more strictly, the severe group that are left also don't have any known shared biomarkers. If you want to try and find them, and that's a whole other debate, that's what research does. This is where depression gets introduced. To quote, the biologizing, or more accurately the pathologizing, of mental health problems and behavioural disorders is a trend right now, both within medicine and in society. And this is in part because it validates and gives substance to people's difficulties. That happens, that works as a mechanism because people aren't believed if there isn't a clear biological element. See one paragraph ago. That may be why, O'Sullivan says, ADHD, autism and depression are now commonly referred to as neurodivergent disorders. Now, Dr. O'Sullivan repeatedly refers to depression as a neurodivergent disorder, that's a contradiction in terms, or under the umbrella of neurodiversity. This is nuanced, there is some debate. Kassiana Asasumasu, who coined neurodivergent as those whose neurocognitive functioning diverges from dominant social norms in multiple ways, is of the view that this should include mental illness. But also, in practice, someone who is otherwise neurotypical, who experiences acute depression and then recovers, is unlikely to identify as neurodivergent. In any event, neurodevelopmental conditions like autism and ADHD are a very different thing to mental health conditions. We get a little bit into the history of neurodiversity. To quote, "The term neurodiversity was coined in 1998 by Australian sociologist Judy Singer." It's actually a bit more complicated than that, but that's beside the point. "It is not actually a medical term, but it does sound like one, so has a biologizing, pathologizing effect."
What could be greased lightning?
Neurodiversity was coined because it sounds like biodiversity. It was designed to be the opposite of pathologizing. Singer is quoted as making that comparison. O'Sullivan notes that various preventable adverse experiences have been shown to increase the risk of ADHD, but they, she argues, are not currently at the forefront of ADHD discussion. Yeah, because it keeps having to firefight this stuff instead. The DSM-5 notes that symptoms of ADHD can be absent in certain environments, which, according to O'Sullivan, suggests that better lives for children will lead to fewer developmental problems in children and later in adults. In other words, if you support people properly, they're going to experience less difficulties and, I guess, less levels of disability. Sounds great. And then, to quote, "Viewing ADHD as a neurochemical disorder has also been an obvious boon for the pharmaceutical industry." There are several paragraphs on, "It's all drugs." So autistic people are discredited because there's no treatment, and people with ADHD are discredited because there is treatment. Make it make sense. O'Sullivan argues that where drugs may work is to help people focus on repetitive, mundane tasks, but that does not necessarily translate to an improvement in creativity or in the sort of complex mental abilities that matter more to relationships, work, and success. Again, I could note that repetitive tasks matter a lot at work and in relationships, because that's what housework is, and that success requires a baseline level of looking after yourself so you don't die, but that has nothing to do with diagnosis. O'Sullivan argues, forgetfulness, lack of motivation, noise intolerance, social anxiety, low mood, distractibility, and concentration difficulties have become increasingly pathologized because of their inclusion in categories in the DSM. Not on their own, she argues, whenever a tightening of diagnostic criteria risks taking a diagnosis away from some people, a new diagnostic label is usually created so nobody will be without a diagnosis. This happens because those people were previously identified as needing support, as per O'Sullivan's definition of what a good diagnosis is, and they don't suddenly not need support. The problem is this system being necessary to be believed. Here we properly get into depression. O'Sullivan goes on a brief detour around antidepressants and whether they may or may not be effective in different groups, which again has nothing to do with the actual diagnosis of depression. She argues that depression has drawn in milder forms of sadness, making it increasingly possible to refer to any low mood in medical terms. Sadness, depression, not the same thing. She does use that terminology throughout. O'Sullivan argues that we all have periods of low mood. Depression that lasts for 2 months, which is not associated with suicidal intent, does not necessarily need medical treatment. People do not seek support for depression on a whim for fun. It's very hard. Lots of people don't do it. In particular, lots of men feel unable to do it, and that's why the suicide rate for men is so high. Like, this is a problem. We should be encouraging more people to seek help for depression. Nobody's doing that on a whim. Again, she says, the fear of public speaking is now diagnosable as a social anxiety disorder. I did do some looking into this. The DSM is not publicly accessible, but in the ICD-11, which is essentially the equivalent by the World Health Organization, Social anxiety disorder uses giving a speech as an example of performing in front of others, but this is far from the only requirement for a diagnosis. The fear must be marked and excessive, persist for an extended period of time, and result in significant distress. You're not going to get the diagnosis just because you're a bit worried about giving a speech. The question I come back to is whether or not medicalising that suffering by giving it a diagnostic label and biologising it by referring to it using genetic and brain-related expressions is the best strategy to make you feel better. This is the more interesting question of the two. It's a much better question than, is this real? But you can't have it both ways. She says that it's positive that mental health is being better recognised, but as always happens when diagnostic inclusivity draws in milder cases, the negative impact of medicalisation, such as the labelling effect, is inevitably ignored. Well, you try talking about your day without the use of nouns and adjectives. O'Sullivan argues that medicalisation can all too easily sideline essential change, and argues that we should be looking to change risk factors like adverse events, poverty, and social isolation, which is very true, but that the availability of medical explanations and chemical solutions for sadness, there it is again, have been very tempting for all concerned. My partner did note that there is already a chemical solution for sadness. It's called alcohol and it comes with its own problems, but that's generally accepted and antidepressants are stigmatised. Worth considering, she notes that troubled behaviour and low mood are inseparable from their social environment and relationships. This is the autistic rights argument. If you change the environment around the person to reduce distress, that will have a knock-on effect of so-called challenging behaviours that might disrupt others. These are the people you were denigrating earlier. Dr. O'Sullivan says, this echoes my sense that my patients' psychosomatic problems are best understood as a maladaptive response to circumstances. The connection of suffering to life events is often very complex and difficult to disentangle, but this is a surer way of responding differently to future adverse life events than any tablet. Does this have the rigorous evidence base that O'Sullivan demanded of medication? I don't know. There's none cited. Now we get into what Dr. O'Sullivan describes as the labelling effect. She argues that if a condition is seen as genetic or brain-based, quote, that risks making it an inextricable part of the person, because that, quote, can't necessarily be repaired. It's permanent. Yes. She says, studies show, does not state which studies, that when a person is labelled as different or other, they sometimes identify with the label and behave differently to conform to it. The thing is, though, if you are neurodivergent, you're going to appear different. And if you're different, you're going to attract a whole host of other labels. I'm just glad that when I started attracting lots of other labels, I knew which one was accurate. There's a great image by Chris Bonello of Autistic Not Weird that I'm going to put up somewhere. Yeah. O'Sullivan says that disorders like neurodiversity come with a set of stereotypes with which people can easily comply. Yes, because when we don't, people tell us we should never have been diagnosed. The age of diagnosis then goes on to talk about illness identity. O'Sullivan defines illness identity as the set of roles and attitudes people develop about themselves in relation to their illness, arguing that identifying very strongly with a diagnosis has been shown to lead to a more negative health outcome. There's one citation here. It's a study based on people with congenital heart disease. O'Sullivan summarises this as, those for whom the illness dominated their identity had more hospitalisations and more visits to their doctor than others with equally complex and severe heart problems. Could it be the other way round? I don't know. And I imagine different diagnoses would be very different here, but again, that's the only citation. O'Sullivan claims being part of a group that is centred around illness can also impact outcome. She cites a study here on severe mental illness, and that groups based on mental health diagnosis develop norms of behaviour that can lead to their symptoms and difficulties being exaggerated. In particular, she notes high group identification in the neurodiverse community, where people talk about finding their tribe. O'Sullivan says, to get better from neurodiversity, an individual must ultimately relinquish their illness identity and develop a new, equally meaningful recovery identity. She briefly touches on a book by Hadley Freeman about her experiences with anorexia, and then, as her main example, dedicates 2 full pages on recovering from long COVID by believing you can, in the Neurodiversity chapter. I suppose I should explain why you can't get better from being neurodivergent, which was a really difficult section to write because I don't usually have to make this argument because it usually goes without saying. We don't really know what causes neurodevelopmental conditions like autism and ADHD. There is probably a genetic element. The age of diagnosis explores this for ADHD, but that doesn't fully explain it. As Dr. O'Sullivan noted in the autism chapter, we can't physically test for autism and ADHD and other neurodevelopmental conditions. It's basically just done from a collection of symptoms, behaviours, and, thankfully now, experiences. The first person ever to be diagnosed with autism, a man named Donald Triplett, died in 2023. That's just 2 years ago. We are really early in our general understanding of how any of this works. And honestly, at this point, it's less of a research priority than developing the supports that will actually help neurodivergent people to thrive and to manage their needs. Because first of all, most of us don't want to be cured. And secondly, it's just really unlikely to happen. Given the genetic component, what is slightly more likely than an autism cure, though to be clear, still very unlikely, is some kind of prenatal genetic test. That has implications for the number of autistic people being born. And that's not hyperbole. In Iceland, where testing for Down syndrome is commonplace, very few people with Down syndrome are born these days, and that's kind of terrifying. But yes, a autism magic cure is basically widely accepted to not going to happen, whether you want it or not. Even the more pathologizing elements of autism research and practice tend to talk about treatments and therapies and interventions to make people look less autistic in the kind of short term for a limited time. No one's doing a magic cure. And the other thing to think about is that, in practice, nobody has ever got better from being neurodivergent. Previous versions of the DSM and the ICD have allowed for things like symptoms disappearing or reducing over time, but we now understand that that's kind of a part of growing up, having more control over your environment, learning things like we all do. None of us are the same as we were when we were 5. But that is not the same as suddenly being neurotypical. Because we now actually recognise that neurodivergent people are people and have, an inner experience that is not just being really annoying to other people. Perhaps this is easiest to think about for those whose neurodivergence is more obvious to others. People with learning disabilities do not wake up one day and not have a learning disability. It doesn't happen. And what would that even look like? It's a part of who that person is, and it's a part of their life. The same is true for other neurodivergents. And even if I could wake up one morning and not be autistic, why would I want to? Sure, there are things I don't like about it. There are challenges I wouldn't face otherwise, but that's true for everybody else. Nobody has a perfectly seamless life. What would I even be? What is me but non-autistic? It's basically somebody else. Sure, there are elements that personally I would love to get rid of, but that's not the same as getting better from autism. And also, crucially, no amount of me saying, oh, I wish I didn't feel like this, is going to make that magically happen. Now, funnily enough, one slight exception to all of this is ADHD. ADHD medication has been in use for some time. It's proven to be workable. Lots of people with ADHD want this and find it helps them and take it part or all of the time. But Dr. O'Sullivan has already made her views on that clear. So, is this actually about having a recovery identity, or is this just about denial? And seamlessly, we're back arguing about mild and severe. To quote, some sufferers, those at the milder end of the various spectrums, are asking to be allowed to be their most authentic neurodivergent selves. So, are they being overdiagnosed, in which case they're fine and this self-expression is fine actually, or do they have a terrible illness they need to have a recovery identity from, in which case a diagnosis is necessary? Pick one. She then says that some subgroups of neurodivergent people welcome this approach, but are still perversely reliant on the medical community for psychological support and medication, and on society for special accommodations. Neurotypical people are also reliant on the medical community for psychological support and medication, and they are reliant on services being set up in a certain way so they can use them. It's just the world is already set up for that. This is the social model of disability. There are interesting questions here about how we can build support for autistic people and people with ADHD in a world beyond pathologizing us with diagnosis, so that we're in effect not disabled anymore. But this book isn't interested in exploring that. O'Sullivan describes neurodiverse as a non-medical term to remind us that all our brains are different. But she then says it's being used in a damaging way in contrast with neurotypical. She does not like the word neurotypical. O'Sullivan quotes various charities, does not name them, that say neurotypical people find certain situations easy or can at least overcome challenges more easily. She says, the division of people into typical and diverse immediately contradicts the sensible statement that we are all different. It brings to mind George Orwell's Animal Farm, where the pigs decide that all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. There are issues with talking about neurotypical people as a kind of monolith. I see it as more of an ideal that some people are closer to than others. But also, this is the only way you can talk about the particular challenges you face compared to others. It's the only way you can talk about structural discrimination. It's why we have the word straight, so we can talk about homophobia. As a friend put it when I told him about this, neurodivergence is much like the book Animal Farm in that both of them involve individuals describing other individuals. O'Sullivan says, neurodivergent conditions are still finding their place, but what is clear is that people with that label are suffering, and then asks whether the ADHD diagnosis outweighs the drawbacks. So we're back here. Quote, it has become standard practice to make accommodations for students with ADHD in school and university, and yet there is a worrying lack of experimental studies to support their use. She cites a few studies showing mixed evidence in this area. We do need more research into what actually works so that accommodations can actually do the job they're supposed to do. Accommodations themselves are not the problem, diagnosis is not the problem, it's a research question. We should be doing more on this. O'Sullivan says, a big problem with these sorts of accommodations is that they promise better school or work performance but don't deliver. They risk creating the expectation that extra support is essential. Students will eventually meet a situation in which no special accommodations are available, and when that happens, a history of assuming they require extra help could set them up for failure. How? Maybe they're being set up for failure because they need the extra support. Of the scores of people I spoke to, she says, all of whom were adults, all perceived their lives to be better off thanks to a diagnosis. But almost all had left their job, dropped out of education, and lost many old friends. Several were housebound. Could that be down to being neurodivergent? Or the lack of support? Or, the pandemic that took place several years before this book was published and it's still ongoing? O'Sullivan argues perhaps what they actually needed from diagnosis was permission to do less in a world that only values particular types of success. And yeah, that sounds good. We should work to provide this outside of diagnosis for everyone, really. But, she says, they were all adults. She argues that telling a child they have a neurodevelopmentally abnormal brain might mean they never get a chance to learn their strengths and to challenge their perceived weaknesses. There are plenty of adults out there who got these diagnoses as children I'm one of them, and I would say quite the opposite. But it doesn't sound like any of us were spoken to. Finally, in the book's conclusion, we're introduced to Darcy, who is 20 and says she couldn't remember ever being 100% well. She has a range of diagnoses, including autism and ADHD, but also hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and postural tachycardia syndrome. O'Sullivan is typically sceptical, pointing out that she had become less active after taking advice for her EDS. Darcy was eventually admitted to hospital to assess regular seizures, where the doctor referred her to O'Sullivan, who assessed that these were psychosomatic. O'Sullivan says that doctors will regularly see young people with various mixes of Darcy's same diagnoses, plus others in the mix, including Tourette's, dyslexia, and dyspraxia, all neurodivergent conditions. Worth bearing in mind that only the seizures and the POTS had any evidence of being psychosomatic. Also, young people can't be disabled, I guess. But O'Sullivan goes further. She says, what most of Darcy's and these other diagnoses have in common is that they each have a severe form that has been recognised for decades, but in the last 20 to 30 years, changes to disease definition have allowed these diagnoses to be made in a milder form that overlaps with normal physiology. The prevalence of the severe form of the disease is stable, while the number of sufferers with a milder form has shot up. None are curable. Once diagnosed, the only treatment is symptomatic and the hope that the symptoms will lessen as they get older. On that note, she compares POTS and EDS to autism and ADHD, because both sets of conditions are defined by drawing a dividing line between normal and abnormal body measurements. Yes, that's how disability works. That's why you need clinical context. Dr. O'Sullivan says she cannot recall meeting a single person with a specific constellation of symptoms that fit with these disorders until 15 or so years ago. Or maybe autistic people were shut out of healthcare until their needs were disruptive enough to other people that it was noticed. O'Sullivan argues that people with POTS and HEDS are more likely to have mild autism and/or ADHD. She then goes on to claim that these disorders simply cannot be linked through a shared pathology. If that was the case, it would follow that people with severe autism and severe ADHD would have the same high rates of HEDS and POTS. They don't. She cites a study which recruited people with diagnoses of autism, ADHD, or Tourette syndrome from an NHS outpatient clinic. The study does not once use the word mild or give any other indication of how each patient might be classified. Again, they were recruited through a clinic, so they probably have a wide range of needs. The word mild is used here as shorthand for, I don't believe these people. O'Sullivan says, these diagnoses coexist because people who express distress through physical symptoms tend to do so with lots of different symptoms that attract a range of diagnoses, and because people who worry about their health tend to worry about all aspects of their health. She is now literally arguing that autism that doesn't look like the stereotype in her head must be psychosomatic. Going back to Darcy, quote, the more I talked to Darcy, the clearer it was that more than just her seizures was psychosomatic, but Darcy's other diagnoses were not considered within my remit. This is why we have specialists. Darcy's response to all of this, by the way, was, you're not an EDS doctor and you're not a POTS doctor, so you have no right to look into those. It sounds like there was no follow-up after Darcy was discharged from Dr. O'Sullivan's own clinic. I have to wonder what Darcy makes of this book, if she even knows she's in it. O'Sullivan says, but I worry most about young people. In a culture that expects success and physical perfection, diagnosis has become a means to account for anything less. That sounds like a much better book. It sounds a lot like Empire of Normality by Robert Chapman. They explore how society has become structured in such a way that normal is a narrower and narrower and narrower group of people. This book doesn't really explore that. O'Sullivan claims we need to be kinder to ourselves when we fail and accept our many imperfections. We need to teach our children to work to their strengths rather than using educational accommodations to hide their weaknesses. The first half of that I really liked. The problem we have is, are neurodivergent children allowed to play to their strengths at school? What is the impact of their weaknesses being the deciding factor in future education and employment prospects? Can we work on that? She does note that those drawing up the new diagnostic criteria are the same people who publish research on autism, who run services for people with autism, whose careers, reputations and incomes will grow the more people with autism they find, and that there are conflicts of interest here. She calls for generalists and primary care doctors to be more involved in these kinds of decisions, which is fair enough, but also this might be why specialism is necessary. She argues that the medicalisation of human experience and over-inclusive diagnoses don't reduce stigma. They promote intolerance by othering, by dividing the world into neurodivergents and neurotypicals. And as a final sentence, let's leave diagnosis for those who are unequivocally sick, according to one person's opinion, I guess, and find a way to be more tolerant of difference and imperfections that still allows people to live an unencumbered life. I like that last bit. So it's probably clear by now that I was not a massive fan of the age of diagnosis, but there are a few elements of Dr. O'Sullivan's arguments that I think are really important. In particular, the age of diagnosis discusses in some detail the lack of benefit that autistic and other disabled people get from being diagnosed, and that is important. That should be ringing alarm bells. That signals a massive gap in support. In general, diagnosis should be the thing that then sets out a pathway to support and care. But in neurodivergence, it's treated as the end goal. That's it. That's the thing you want, and then there's nothing else after that. For a lifelong difference. However, instead of highlighting this and questioning why there's no support, which means that people aren't getting the best out of diagnosis, the book just pins the blame on diagnosis itself. Similarly, Dr. O'Sullivan discusses at different points the role of the social environment in shaping the challenges that neurodivergent people face, and to a certain extent, how we see those labels at all. She argues, albeit very intermittently, that the right adjustments can reduce the difficulties that a person faces in a particular situation, in effect making them less disabled, and that we shouldn't need a clinical diagnosis to be able to put those adjustments in place. I agree. I would love to see a world where, for example, autistic people can have their needs met and have structures and environments that work for them without having to jump through a load of hoops first to get a bit of paper with a medical diagnosis on it to be the special exception. And that, in turn, would free up clinical time for where there is a need for clinical support. However, if you want to get to that world, which I do, the first step to that is actually believing people when they tell you what they need without insisting that it's immediately suspicious and asking for some kind of proof beforehand. Narratives like this undermine that belief. What most people hear is, oh, some people who say they're autistic aren't really autistic, and so they will be more suspicious of these needs. And ironically, that might push more people into seeking a clinical diagnosis so that they're believed, to overcome that hurdle that has needlessly just been put in place. So there are ideas within the age of diagnosis that have a lot of merit, and I think we should be discussing further. There are also bits that are just kind of culture war stuff with varying relation to diagnosis. And as you can probably tell from the haphazard structure of this video, the book jumps around quite a lot in between all of these arguments. The goalposts shift whenever an argument seems to be petering out, or whenever there might be an opportunity to talk about the support gap rather than blaming diagnosis. The book is very clearly and eloquently written, and Dr. O'Sullivan is clearly coming from a place of genuine compassion for her patients and ultimately wanting everybody to live the best life that they can live. However, there's a lot of magical thinking involved in the idea that the patients will not have the challenges associated with these diagnoses if they just didn't have the diagnoses. The arguments that do actually point towards meaningfully improving the lives of the people that Dr. O'Sullivan is talking about don't quite stick the landing, and the culture war stuff is, as unproductive as culture war stuff always is. And as we've seen in other culture wars, the age of diagnosis seems to be being cited more than it's being read. I've talked a little bit already about the massive press coverage that this book has had and the various columns and media appearances that Dr. O'Sullivan has made. We're also seeing these arguments echoed by politicians, and often imperfectly. Dr. O'Sullivan is fairly clear that she defines overdiagnosis as a diagnosis that might be correct but that doesn't benefit the patient. She doesn't always stick to that, but she gives that definition clearly, and that's not how politicians are using it. They're using it to mean how most people would see overdiagnosis as this is too much diagnosis. In April 2025, the UK Supreme Court ruled that single-sex spaces, as designated under the Equality Act, could legally exclude trans people and be restricted based on biological sex. They don't define what that means, by the way. Under the Equality Act, a single-sex space can be designated if it is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So if that's a route you want to go down, there are still hurdles to overcome, and in practice, this applies to very few things. However, in the days and weeks since that Supreme Court judgment, we've seen statements and policies and new rules that go well beyond what is needed to comply with that judgment. Trans women in particular being barred from a whole range of sports, lots of pontificating about bathrooms and banning trans people from using just any bathroom, I guess. And in the case of British Transport Police, even just coming out and saying that they're going to do strip searches in a transphobic way. The Supreme Court judgment does not require any of this, but it was a jumping on point for people and organisations who already wanted to do certain things to have an excuse to do it. Most people aren't going to read the judgment, so most people aren't going to be any the wiser. Obviously, that's a very different context, and there is a big difference between a high-profile book and a legal judgment, but there are similar things at play here. Most people will know that there's a high-profile book out by a respected clinician about how everything's overdiagnosed these days, and that's as far as they'll take it. And you can do a lot of damage with that. It's essentially kind of an academic-ish cover for all of politics suddenly singling out disabled people, and neurodivergent people in particular. In the introduction to the Age of Diagnosis, Dr. O'Sullivan makes explicit that she is not calling for reduction in financial support or rationing of care services for disabled people. But in a political context, these arguments are almost invariably being made around disability benefits. Do you think the government are paying close attention to that line? I doubt it. And the frustrating thing is, it seems to be so easy to put a misconception out there and so hard to correct it. The onus is on disabled people and their families who, by and large, do not have the kind of media platform that those perpetuating the misconception have to defend themselves on top of whatever it is they're already doing to survive as a disabled person, and at such a higher emotional cost. I'll be honest with you, reading The Age of Diagnosis kind of consumed me. My partner kept joking about how I would wake up in the morning and immediately start talking about the book. Now, autism and neurodiversity is a real special interest of mine. I chose to do this to myself. I'm not complaining about that. But that can be a double-edged sword, because for the couple of weeks I had with the book, it very much did take over. As I mentioned, there are other books in this space, and the two that I'm aware of are written by child psychiatrists who have experience in diagnosing autism. So I find that really interesting, and I want to read them all, but I don't know if I have it in me right now. And if nothing else, it takes a lot of time to read the book in its entirety, make the notes, respond to all the arguments, put together something like this, and it's only going to make a tiny, tiny dent in the giant media circus around the original narrative that autism is overdiagnosed. One other element of the Age of Diagnosis that I found really interesting is that it takes arguments that have long been used against neurodivergent people, Things like creating a false binary between mild and severe, deserving and undeserving, and pitting those groups against each other like we don't all basically want the same thing, and applies that argument to a much wider range of conditions, including physical health conditions. I can't help but feel like neurodivergent people are basically the acceptable thin end of the wedge here, and that if this narrative takes hold in politics, in public opinion, in the press, other disability groups could be next. I've been concerned in recent months, more generally, that the narrative and the rhetoric around autism has kind of been going backwards, and I can't help but wonder, what else could we be doing if we weren't constantly having to firefight stuff like this? What progress could we be making on addressing the support gap, on developing the tools that neurodivergent people need, on improving attitudes and understanding around the need to make basic adjustments? Then we could actually create a world where there's less of a need for clinical diagnosis instead of a counterproductive media circus. Now, YouTube is a new platform for me. I've never done this before. I don't know if I will again. Maybe, we'll see. I prefer to write stuff. I'm mindtheflap on all the socials, and I have a blog, mindtheflap.wordpress.com. I guess I'm meant to end this with a call to action, so join your local library.